Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 30, Section 2, World War II. To begin with, we're going to talk a little bit about how the United States gets involved into this World War. And we're going to talk about the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was kind of the result of Japanese military expansion and aggression, their alliance basically with Germany and Italy, and also a U.S. ban on the sale of oil to Japan. And not only that, but the U.S. had also embargoed the sale of scrap metal. Steel that was being used by the Japanese to make uh, aircraft and other heavy machinery that was going to be used in the war. This attack on Pearl Harbor uh, was actually done on December 7th, 1941. But the truth is, the planning for this attack had actually been almost a year in advance. So really, you could go back the to 1940, and you probably could find evidence that there was something in the works here. The United States and Japan had actually been in a series of talks, trying to kind of come up with some type of agreement, and for some reason, the talks kind of kind of tapered off, and eventually, this allows for this attack to happen. Just so we understand, Pearl Harbor is actually a naval base that still exists today, and it's located basically on the island of Oahu, which, if you know anything about Hawaiian geography, that is where the capital city of Honolulu is located. And the naval base at Pearl Harbor was actually where the U.S. Pacific Fleet was stationed. For many years, it had been stationed in San Diego, and as the war was kind of looking like it was going to happen, there was a decision made at the Pentagon to move the naval fleet to Honolulu with the idea that it would be a little closer to where all the action was going to be. And the hope would be that if something would arise, that this fleet would be a little closer and be able to strike, more efficiently. But at the same time, it kind of left the military a little bit vulnerable. Our Navy needed aircraft to protect it, and they were kind of in short supply. When you talk about supplying, okay, it was harder to supply a Navy, which is, in the middle of the Pacific, than it would have been if it were stateside in California. So there were a lot of issues here, but on the morning of December 7th, the Japanese had basically been planning this for a long time. They had rehearsed it, and they knew exactly what they were targeting. If you take a look on the map below here, there is a map of what is known as Ford Island, which is sometimes known as Battleship Row, because many of the different battleships that were being used in the Pacific were located here. And if you take a look at the kind of the key down below, you can see that there were a number of ships that were sunk that day or were damaged. For example, probably some of the more famous ships like the USS Arizona, the USS Nevada, the West Virginia, the USS Oklahoma, USS California, and Utah all sunk. As a matter of fact, when you talk about today, only two ships remain submerged here as kind of a memorial. The USS Utah, which most civilians don't have access to because that is an active part of the military base. And then the other is the USS Arizona, which is actually part of the National Park System. It is actually probably better way to define it. It's more like a memorial, but at the same time, kind of like a grave for those sailors who were aboard that ship. Matter of fact, their remains were never exhumed. So they lie in state in that ship yet to this day. The Nevada, the West Virginia, the Oklahoma, the California, all these ships were actually brought into what is known as dry dock, and they were actually repaired and put back into action before the end of the war. So that part is amazing. I mentioned earlier Yamamoto, Admiral Yamamoto. He is pictured here in this photograph. He is the mastermind behind this. He believed that the best way uh, for the Japanese to strike is to use aircraft. And he was one of the big proponents for the Navy to kind of get on board with using aircraft. And, much to the surprise of a lot of people here in the United States, he executed a very good plan. And obviously, there was a lot of damage that was done on that day. Just so you understand, the attack on Pearl Harbor was really a multifaceted attack. Not only did they attack ships, but they also attacked some of the different military institutions that were there on this island. Wheeler Field is an Army base. Back in the old days, before there was an Air Force, there was an Army Air Corps, and there were airplanes that were stationed there, and they targeted those. Kenau, which is kind of on the eastern northern part of the island, is a Marine base that was targeted. Bellows Field is another airstrip. It was targeted. Hickam Field, which is basically now today Honolulu's international airport, that was targeted. And not only did they do it with one wave, but they did it with two waves. They could have done it with three. They had planned a third strike, but they never executed it. But needless to say, they certainly were able to be very effective that day. So there's a question that's been out there by historians about whether or not this attack on Pearl Harbor was a complete surprise. And there were some things that we probably, had we been maybe paying attention a little better, we might have been able to keep this attack from being so brutally one sided. One thing that you should know is that in the months kind of leading up to Pearl Harbor, the United States had actually figured out Japan's secret code. Not only were they paying attention to the diplomatic information that was passing through these code channels, but they were also getting some information about military movements. The secret device that allowed us to break this code was this deciphering machine called Purple, which was top secret. It was kind of like computer technology at the time. And for some reason, we were able to decode this. Um, Originally, when it was decoded from numbers into Japanese, and then it had to be um, basically transposed from Japanese into English to make it make sense. But we knew that something was up in the days before this attack happened. And there was a lot of concern in Washington, but yet not a whole heck of a lot was done. Morning of the attack started around 8 a.m. Honolulu time, about probably about 2 p.m. our time. Uh, for some reason, the Navy had been running some ships out into the Pacific, not very far from the harbor entrance, and they spotted and attacked some Japanese midget subs within 3 hours of this attack. Just so you understand, these midget subs were part of this envoy group that came for the initial attack on Pearl Harbor, and the goal would be to see if these subs could actually enter into the harbor. On board the sub were two Japanese sailors, and they were launched actually from basically like a torpedo tube. But needless to say, the mission of these subs was basically to make sure that uh, they the Japanese could actually carry off this attack. Uh, Individuals who were in those subs, for the most part, were volunteering for a suicide mission. And roughly, I don't know, I've read upwards to about eight or nine of these subs in the days following the attack actually washed ashore the island of Oahu. So it seems like it was kind of well planned in that regard. Finally, one thing that we did see, but we didn't react to it, was the fact that this big blob of aircraft that was coming in had been actually spotted on radar. What's interesting is radar was top secret technology at this time. Matter of fact, it was eventually or actually invented by the British, and they had been using against against the Germans during the Battle of Britain during 1940. And we had actually set up some different radar locations in Hawaii. But at the same time, we really didn't understand what data we were interpreting here. And so the morning of this attack, uh, the people who were operating the radar had seen something. They had called it in. They were told not to worry about it, partially because we were expecting some aircraft to come in from California, and they were thinking that's what it was. Had they really been paying attention, we might have been able to get some airplanes up in the air to fight off the Japanese, but we never did. So, um, there are some people that also say that, the Japanese were kind of asking for trouble attacking Pearl Harbor. And the question is, why was this Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, doomed to fail? And there's a couple of reasons. One, granted, the initial attack was very successful, but I mean, as far as a war that's going to be carried off, Japan didn't attack a couple of things that they could have attacked the morning of December 7th. And one was our fuel supply. Uh, just right off the harbor, you can see Pearl Harbor kind of in this photograph here, but off to the left there are a bunch of these white tanks. And that, my friends, is the entire supply of fuel for the military for the Pacific. Had the Japanese targeted those tanks, we would have been out of commission for a long period of time, much longer than we were. But they didn't even touch these tanks during the attack, which is really surprising. Other thing that they weren't able to attack that gave us an advantage in the months to follow was our naval carriers. By chance, the morning of December 7th, our carriers, there were two of them that were in the Pacific, were nowhere near Pearl Harbor, and hence they survived this attack. And as a result, they're going on the hunt. They're looking for the Japanese, and in time, they're going to find them. Today, if you would travel to Pearl Harbor, you might get to visit the USS Arizona Memorial. This was a memorial that was built in the 1960s. It actually sits on top of the remains of the USS Arizona. There's one thing I want to draw your attention to, and this is in the larger photo, is that there is a constant oil slick that is above this ship, and partially because the ship keeps bubbling up oil from its hull. And it will probably continue to do that until roughly uh, the 2040s. Some people say about 100 years of this oil, and then it will stop. So that itself kind of is an interesting reminder to this. But uh, people who are tourists who travel here, the thing that you have to remember is if you go on board this memorial, it is like going into a church. It's very solemn. You're not allowed to run around or to talk really loud because there are still people that go there to mourn the loss of family and loved ones. So it is kind of held in a certain amount of respect by a lot of tourists that travel here. And what's interesting is this is an international site. This is a site that if you travel to, you're probably going to see Japanese tourists that are going to be here trying to kind of grapple with what happened on December 7th. All right, going back. When we talk about Japanese military, the head of the Japanese government was Prime Minister General Hideki Tojo. Tojo came into office really kind of in 1941, and he was kind of a militant guy, probably right along the same levels of guys like Mussolini and Hitler in terms of how he wanted to have things handled as far as his enemies were concerned. During the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese were able to destroy our Pacific Fleet's aircraft, which weren't able to uh, destroy our aircraft carriers, which were at sea at the time of the attack. In the early months of the war, kind of starting in 1942, the Japanese were better equipped and fighting closer to their home, so they had a certain advantage. They were easily able to conquer places like Singapore, Hong Kong, Burma, many of the strategic islands that were in the Pacific. We did, as the United States, get one little jab at Japan, and that was a group of pilots known as the Doolittle Raiders. They actually launched an attack on Japan in I think the spring of 1942, just a few months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, where they used these aircraft carriers, but they had used bigger aircraft like I think they were the B-24 Marauders, which they flew off the carriers. This is not a fighter plane. This is actually a bomber plane, which typically doesn't fly off of the carrier. But these aircraft were flown over Japan and they dropped bombs. Granted, they didn't do a lot of damage, but it was a psychological thing to let the Japanese understand that uh, even though you attacked us, we can still reach out and get you on your home ground. Many of the aircraft that were part of the Raiders had actually ran out of fuel before they had actually met their landing site. The landing site was actually in China. The goal originally was to give these aircraft to the Chinese so that they could fight the Japanese, kind of on our behalf. But because the Raiders had to launch their aircraft a little bit sooner because they had been spotted by a Japanese fishing boat, uh, the aircraft themselves, many of them ran out of fuel. But needless to say, a lot of our pilots survived and had amazing stories to talk about for years. Number five, Americans held in the Philippines were a target of the Japanese. The Philippine Islands actually were kind of like a territory for the United States at this period of time, or a protectorate. And we had American civilians there that were living in the Philippines, and the military had a presence there. And the man who was kind of in charge of the U.S. Army in the Philippines was a guy named General Douglas MacArthur. He had actually led his troops until they surrendered in April of 1942. And as the Japanese were closing in, uh, the Pentagon told him to get out. And so he leaves and says, I shall return. But needless to say, the Japanese were able to capture many of our troops that remained. And as a result, they forced about 70,000 of our American soldiers and some of our Filipino allies on a march to a distant prison known as the Bataan Death March. And part of it was this: if you had turned around to help a colleague or a soldier that was falling behind, the Japanese would pull you aside and execute you. So, uh, the march itself was brutal. Hot temperatures, no water, just lousy conditions in that regard. But when these prisoners got to the camps, it was worse. And many of these soldiers had to endure some of the worst conditions you could ever imagine. There were soldiers who survived this, and it was a very traumatic situation for many of them. In May of 1942, the Japanese and U.S. aircraft carriers first came together at the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Battle of the Coral Sea is kind of to northeast of the continent of Australia. If you know where the Great Barrier Reef is, this is kind of that vicinity. Anyway, this battle marked the first time that the Japanese advance had been actually stopped. And in the long run, that meant that the United States and Japan were going to have to grind it out. About a month after the Battle of the Coral Sea, there was another major naval battle known as the Battle of Midway. Midway is literally the midway point in the Pacific between Asia and the United States. Midway is an atoll. It's actually kind of a top of an underwater volcano. As you can kind of see in the photograph below, there is no civilians that live here, but it's actually strategically uh, been a naval base and also an air base for the United States. So, looking at the map, if we were looking kind of in the 1940s, 1943 ish, anything that is kind of to the left of this line is that you see here in red is really the Japanese territory. The goal for the Allies, primarily the United States, was to kind of get to the Japanese mainland. But we had a lot of territory to cover. And so we had to be strategic about the islands that we wanted to conquer. The Japanese, in many cases, had put troops out in different areas. The goal was not to take every island, but to cut off some of these islands from some of their supplies. And eventually we were able to do that. All right. The U.S. military, as I mentioned before, had broken the Japanese secret code used to transmit messages and knew the date and the location of the Japanese planned attack at Midway, which happened in June of 1942. And number 8, the Allies' strategy of skipping over Japanese strongholds and to capture the weaker targets, which were going to be used for bases for the next attack and moving ever closer to Japan, was something known as island hopping or leapfrogging. This strategy cut the Japanese strongholds off from their outside supplies, and eventually it weakened them. At the same time, when you talk about secret codes, one advantage that the United States had over the Japanese military was the idea that we were using our Native Americans and their language to kind of help us kind of get our messages across to our military. And one of the codes that was never broken by the Japanese was actually the Navajo codes. And so there were a group of Marines known as Navajo Code Talkers. These were young men who had been in the Marine Corps, who had been trained in the Navajo language to basically be able to give coded messages to the battlefront and to receive and to send. And for the most part, it made it better for our troops to travel in the Pacific because of this. Thank you very much.